Hello, my name is Bradley Sendel, and for my Life in the Renaissance class, I decided to do a project and a presentation on the Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses was a civil war that took place in England between 1455 and 1487 between two cadet branches of the Plantagenet family. The first branch was the Lancaster side. They are represented by their sigil, the Red Rose. And they fought against their cousins, the Yorks, which are represented by the White Rose. There are so many people who have similar names in this presentation that for simplicity's sake, when you see a red rose and a white rose in the corners, it means it's more of a neutral slide. Two red roses means it's a Lancaster slide, two white roses means it is a York slide, and in the end of the presentation there will be a third rose, and you'll discover why it is both red and white when we get there. So before going any further, I'm going to explain to you some titles that I'm going to be using through my presentation. First, there is the king. Obviously, there is supposed to be one king, and he is in charge of everything. The Prince of Wales is traditionally his eldest son, who rules over Wales, which is in the west of England. And he rules over this small domain as a way of teaching him how to become a ruler and how to become king. Then there is the Duke. A Duke is one of the highest ranks of nobility, and the Duke is often one of the princes, one of the younger sons of the king. Earl is another name. You could have rich earls and small earls, but it's just basically all earl means is lord. So if you think you'd call someone a lord, their title is usually an earl. So now I'm going to explain to you the Plantagenet family. The Plantagenet family had been ruling over England since 1127, when Henry II became king. And Henry II had a bunch of children, and then eventually they had kids. And we get all the way to Edward III. Now, Edward III wanted a dynastic rule, meaning that he wanted as much of his blood, as much of his family, on the thrones of Europe. So he had many kids, which worked out for him, but didn't work out for them. So his eldest son was Edward the Black Prince. Edward the Black Prince, named so because from 16 years onwards, for the rest of his life, he was considered a great warrior and a great leader in battle. And the French feared him because he was such a great battle commander. And he had a son, Richard II. Now, we'll be looking at this family tree in depth a little later on, but for right now, the three most important people are Edward the Black Prince, Richard II, and of course, John of Gaunt, the third surviving son of Edward III. Now, the way inheritance works for the throne is that it goes to the eldest son, and then if the eldest son dies, it would go to the eldest son's children. So for example, it would go to Edward the Black Prince, and then it would go to Richard, and then if Richard died without having any male children, it would go to Lionel. And if Lionel died without having male children, it would go to John, and go through his children, and so on and so forth. Now, by the time Edward III dies, Lionel is dead and has no male children. So his branch of the family is basically out of the line of succession. So now we're going to look at Edward III's death. A year before Edward died, in 1376, his eldest son, Edward the Black Prince, died, leaving his own son, who was quite young at the time. He was only 10 years old when Edward III died, leaving Richard II as king. Now, you can't have a 10-year-old boy ruling the realm, waging war, and levying taxes. His lords won't respect him, and he doesn't have the experience to know what he's doing. So a regent is appointed to rule over the kingdom. Now what the regent basically is think of a prime minister. His job is to step in, rule the realm until Richard II becomes 18 years old and has enough experience to manage the kingdom. Now, the regent they decided to pick was the eldest living son of Edward III. That's eldest living son, not the eldest son, but the one that was still alive, John of Gaunt. John of Gaunt was Richard II's uncle, and also the heir to the throne. He was one of the richest men in England. It is estimated that in 2012 American dollars, he is worth 110 billion, which makes him the 16th richest man of all time. Now, he's important because he could have decided to become king himself and overthrow his nephew. He had the support, but he made a promise to Edward the Black Prince and to Edward III that he would not take the crown and that he'd watch out for his nephew. John of Gaunt was made the Duke of Lancaster when he married Blanche, who was the heir to the title, and from the land he ruled, from Lancaster, he decided to make his family name Lancaster. Now, officially, his family name was Plantagenet, but his house was known as the House of Lancaster. Now, the important children we have to look at for John of Gaunt is Henry Bolingbroke and the Beaufort children. Henry Bolingbroke is his eldest son, and we'll look at the legitimized Beaufort bastards later on. So, Henry Bolingbroke got into many political fights with Richard II, and causing Henry to eventually be exiled from England during the 1390s. When John of Gaunt died in 1399, Richard II decided to disinherit Henry Bolingbroke because he didn't like his cousin. Now, imagine you are the heir to a $110 billion fortune, and your cousin, who is much older now than he was, he's no longer a 10-year-old boy, he's 22 years old, decides to take away all your money. You'd be pretty upset. And so was Henry Bolingbroke. Side note, he's named Henry Bolingbroke because he was born in Bolingbroke Castle. So it's like Henry of Bolingbroke. Just like John of Gaunt was born in the land of Gaunt, he's John of Gaunt. Anyways. So John of Gaunt is dead. Henry Bolingbroke is disinherited, and he decides to come back from exile with an army and overthrows Richard II. Henry Bolingbroke becomes Henry IV, and Richard II dies mysteriously in prison. Now, for time's sakes, this is not the official start of the Wars of the Roses. This is the lead up to the Wars of the Roses and why they're taking place. So I'm not going to go into great length into the reign of Henry IV and his eldest son, Henry V. All we have to know is in 1413, Henry IV dies after being king for 14 years, and his eldest son, Henry V, becomes king until 1422. Now, a brief chronology from our prologue is to what has happened till now is from in 1377, Edward III dies and Richard II becomes king. In February 1399, John of Gaunt dies and Henry Bolingbroke is dispossessed, is uninherited. So in September of the same year, Henry comes back to England and deposes Richard II and becomes Henry IV. In 1413, Henry IV dies and Henry V is now king, and 2 years later the Battle of Agincourt occurs. The Battle of Agincourt is the legendary English victory of Henry V over the French, killing so many French nobles with much... Henry had so many fewer men, but he had the English longbow, and they were able to decimate the French forces, killing so many French nobles that the King of France, who is rumored to have been a little mad at the time, a little crazy, had created a peace agreement with Henry where when the King of France died, he would give France to Henry V, all of France, because France had been so weakened. But part of this peace agreement was that Henry would marry one of the King of France's daughters, and that their children would inherit the crown. So in essence, the kings of England, the kings of France would once again get together, have children, and at least the King of France's grandson would become King of France. This also disinherited the Dauphin, who was the heir to the French crown, the oldest French prince, and he was very unhappy about this. In 1422, Henry V dies, leaving his infant son, the 9-month-old Henry, now Henry VI, King of England. 3 months later, the King of France dies, leaving the year-old Henry. Henry VI, King of England and France, and one of the most powerful men in Europe and in medieval history. Now, there is much dispute over what Henry VI was. I decided to try and look for a neutral source as a way of explaining to you what Henry was and how he was as a king. Now, if you look at the York side, because this is really where the Wars of the Roses begins, Henry is considered, from the York perspective, as being a terrible king. From the Lancaster side, he's considered as being an okay king. So I went to the Encyclopedia Britannica, and this is a quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica about Henry VI's reign. After the death of Henry V in 1422, the country was subject to a long and factious minority of Henry VI. Great magnates with private armies dominated the countryside. Lawlessness was rife and taxation burdensome. Henry later proved to be feckless and simple-minded, subject to spells of madness and dominated by his ambitious queen, Margaret of Anjou, whose party had allowed the English possession in France to deteriorate. That is a neutral source. That is someone who has no say in this fight. So, just an observer, saying how bad of a king Henry was. And he was mad. He would have spurts of crazy. In 1445, he marries Margaret of Anjou, who is a French noble's daughter, and he gives up territory in France as in order to do so. He gives that to her father, English territory in France, to her father as part of the marriage agreement. Now, Margaret of Anjou is a very strong woman and politically wants a lot. Now, before getting into really what happens in the Wars of the Roses, I have to explain to you a couple more guys who will play key roles in the wars. First, there is the leader of the York faction, who is Richard of York, the third Duke of York. He was Edward III. He's a grandson of Edward III through Edward's fourth surviving son. Then there is his heir, who is also one of the leaders, Edward of York, the Earl of March, and their cousin, whose nickname is the Kingmaker, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. Now, I'll refer to him as Warwick or the Kingmaker instead of Richard because there are already too many Richards in this story. But the Kingmaker was one of the richest men in all of England. It is said that he'd have an estimated income from his lands of about 6,000 British pounds, which at the time was an enormous amount of money. So back with the family tree. Right now what we're left with is Henry VI and Richard the Duke of York. Now, when you look at their claims, Henry has the best claim because he comes from the eldest son, from the third son, and he's a direct descendant. Now, Richard comes from the third son, which means he is behind Henry VI. But he has a claim that his mother is a direct descendant of the second son. Although the female line means nothing, he will use this as a claim to get to the throne. So right now you have the granddaughter of the second son and the grandson of the fourth son against the grandson of the third son, with Henry VI having a much better claim to the throne. Now, war breaks out because in 1453, Henry officially loses the title of King of France because he has lost so much land in France, because of how much political strife is going on in England, how his wife has been managing his affairs, and how his lords have been handling his affairs, because he is not a very active king. Henry, when he hears the news that he's lost France, goes mad, goes crazy. So in 1454, Richard, the Duke of York, establishes his first protectorate, which means he's not the regent, but what he does, he becomes the de facto prime minister. He's running the government, while Henry is out of sorts. A year later, Henry VI recovers, and York is pushed out politically by Margaret of Anjou and Henry. So in the same year, active fighting begins between the first of them. The First Battle of St. Albans occurs, York wins, and he establishes his second protectorate. So he's in charge again. It's more of a military charge, but he still has Henry as king, and Henry still has a lot of power and influence as well, but he has to work with Richard. In 1459, York forces out York is forced out of England. He must go to Ireland. Must go to Ireland, and then the war really starts. There are more battles, and York decides in 1460 that he's going to claim the throne. He beats Henry's soldiers, comes into London and says, "I want to be king." But Parliament does not allow him to be king. What they do is they disinherit Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou's son, Edward. Another Edward. You'll see there's a lot of Edwards in this story, a lot of Henrys and a lot of Richards. And in October of 1460, Richard, the Duke of York, is named Prince of Wales and Protector of the Realm. And this is an official act of Parliament. So when Henry VI dies, Richard will become king. But until then, he is merely the heir and he's the protector of the realm. However, 2 months later, Richard and his second eldest son, Edmund, are killed in battle. They rode out of York with a very small army against Margaret of Anjou's much bigger army, and were killed and eventually decapitated for their quote-unquote crimes in the mind of Margaret of Anjou against her and her husband. So when Richard dies, his eldest son, Edward, takes up his cause. And over the next year, he keeps winning battles with the help of Warwick, who teaches him how to be a great military commander. He defeats one of the main Lancastrian armies, marches onto London, and in 1461, he is named King of England, while Henry VI is still King of England, though he is no longer in London. So right now you have two kings of England fighting against each other. This is crazy, but Edward has the support of many people. And he has Warwick, who's the most powerful lord in all of England at this time. So throughout 1461, the Lancastrians keep losing, all the way until 1464, where the Battle of Hexham takes place, which is one of the biggest Lancastrian defeats in the Wars of the Roses. And a year later, Henry VI is captured and is imprisoned. Now, Edward is a great military commander, but not the smartest politician and not the best king. He is supposed to marry a princess of France and create a peace alliance with France. However, he marries for beauty and for love, and marries Elizabeth Woodville. Now, Elizabeth Woodville is seen as not being very much. On her father's side, she is no more than landed gentry. On her mother's side, she is a descendant of Charlemagne. But her mother is a woman, and like I said, women can't really inherit. So just because your mother is something great, it really matters what your father is. She was a few years older than Edward, 5 to be exact, and she had been married before to Sir John Grey, who had fought on the Lancastrian side and died fighting against the Yorks. So the two of them got married in 1464 and kept the marriage secret for 4 months. Why did they keep it secret? Well, she was beautiful, but she was considered very much beneath him, and Warwick, Edward's biggest supporter, was very upset because there would be no alliance with France, and what came with her was the Woodville package. She had 5 brothers, 7 sisters, and 2 sons, all of whom were unmarried and needed either dowries for the girls or wives to find for the boys, and maybe put in positions of power. So Warwick was mad that there was going to be no alliance with France and that the Woodvilles would receive much influence. And he saw the Woodvilles as not being worth very much. Now, also what's important is Edward IV, for that is what it was called now, had 2 brothers, living brothers left. He had George, the second eldest, the Duke of Clarence, and Richard, the Duke of Gloucester, who were some of his biggest political supporters. They had armies of their own, and they were one of the reasons he was able to win the crown. Now, George was very envious of his brother, while Richard was a very dutiful younger brother. In 1469, the Second Wars of the Roses begins, when Warwick, who is upset, teams up with George, Edward's brother, marries Isabel Neville, who is Warwick's daughter, and they decide to rebel against Edward to put George on the throne. This way, Warwick's daughter will become queen, and Warwick's grandchildren will one day rule England if they win. So in July, Warwick defeats and imprisoned Edward IV. Elizabeth Woodville's father and one of her many brothers are killed in the fighting, so she's very unhappy with this. In September of the same year, Warwick and George release Edward because they weren't able to come to an agreement with Parliament to make George king, and Edward decides to forgive them. He loves his cousin and he loves his brother. The next year, in 1470, Warwick and George try again to rebel, but they lose and they end up having to flee to France. Warwick realizes that with George, he's not going to win. So he tries to find another ally in order to help him get his grandchildren onto the throne. So in France, he meets another person who had to flee to France, Margaret of Anjou, Henry VI's wife. So Warwick marries his only other child, Anne Neville, his daughter, to Henry VI and Margaret of Anjou's son, Edward of Westminster. If you notice, you see that the flowers are now red, because they are now on the Lancastrian side. And Warwick decides to fight for Margaret of Anjou and her husband, and is now on the Lancastrian side, and they decide to invade England together, and between the two of them, they think they could take England back from Edward. So in September of 1470, Warwick invades England and France. He forces out Edward IV, who flees to Holland. Now Warwick went first, and Margaret of Anjou was supposed to follow him later on, but the weather wasn't very good for sailing across the English Channel from France into England. Warwick restores Henry VI to the throne, and this lasts for less than a year. Warwick, while Henry VI is on the throne, is acting as a sort of prime minister, because Henry VI isn't very well mentally, and as he's doing so, he's waiting for Margaret of Anjou to come with her son and with her army. But before this can happen, Edward IV returns in March and starts fighting again. So it's York versus Lancaster yet again. George, who was on Warwick's side up until this point, decides to switch sides yet again and help his brother out, taking a lot of soldiers from the Lancastrian side and moving them to the York side. So not only is Warwick and the Lancastrians losing men, but Edward is gaining men. In April, there's the Battle of Barnet, where the York side had maybe half as many soldiers as the Warwick side, but the York side, Edward, was able to triumph and upset the Lancastrian army. Here is where the so-called Warwick myth takes place, where Warwick is said to have what would happen in fighting is, if one side was losing, that side's commanders, their nobles, would ride off on their horses, and all the men would get slaughtered. So Warwick decided that, in front of all his men, he'd kill his horse, and he told them that if they'd lose the fight, he'd die with them, which gave his men a lot of spirit. They were very happy, but they ended up winning anyways, and Warwick dies in the fighting. Edward is restored to the crown and will reign until 1483, which is his natural death. In May, the Battle of Tewkesbury occurs, which is when Margaret of Anjou's army comes to England. The Lancastrians lose. Henry VI dies mysteriously while imprisoned. Margaret of Anjou is in prison and will stay in prison for the rest of her life. And Edward of Westminster, their son, dies in the fighting. George will continue, although he's reconciled with his brother, he will continue to cause trouble and spread rumors about Edward IV being a bastard son and not having the right to the throne, and Elizabeth Woodville being a witch, and in 1478 he is executed as a traitor. And then Edward rules more or less peacefully until 1483, like I said, until his natural death. Now, his death causes a problem. Elizabeth and Edward IV had many children. They only had 2 boys, but they had many daughters. We're not going to talk about all of the daughters now because they're not important for our purpose. We're just going to talk about the eldest, Elizabeth of York, who will appear later on in our story, Edward, the Prince of Wales, who was the heir, and Richard, who was Duke of York, Richard of Shrewsbury, who is the second eldest son. So, when Edward IV dies, his 12-year-old son becomes Edward V, but is never officially crowned. Richard, who, if you remember, is the only other brother of Edward IV, is named Lord Protector. He's the person put in charge of Edward V's minority. While he's a child, Richard will rule over the land and help him become a better king. Now, Elizabeth Woodville, who doesn't like Richard, recalls her son as well as her brother and brings them under guard from Wales to England. Richard, seeing a problem with ruling with Elizabeth and trying to rule through her son, decides to send men to arrest Elizabeth's brother Anthony and to take Edward V into custody. So it works out. Richard gains custody of Edward V, and Richard then accuses and executes lords he believes are conspiring with Elizabeth against them. Why did he think they were conspiring against them? Because they were. In 1483, Richard uses rumors of Edward V being a bastard, saying that their mother had an affair and Edward wasn't their father's son, and also used another rumor saying that Edward V had been married before he had married Elizabeth, married officially, meaning that the second marriage to Elizabeth was null and void, and all the children they had were bastards. So all of the Edward V's children were disinherited. So if the children can inherit, the uncle would. So in July, Richard becomes Richard III officially with the help of Parliament. And Elizabeth Woodville and her children go into hiding. So, Richard III. Richard III marries Anne Neville, who, if you remember, married Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI then, but he was now dead. She was a widow, a very rich widow, and marries Richard III. Richard has, the two of them have a son, Edward of Middleham, but he dies at the age of 11, which hurts his mother very badly. His passing does not go well with her, and she becomes very sickly afterwards. So as it stands right now, you have Richard III, you have Elizabeth Woodville and her children, and now I'm going to introduce a third party, the Tudor party, into the mix. Now, how do we get to the Tudor party? Well, if you remember, there were the Beaufort children. The Beaufort children were John of Gaunt's children. Now, what had happened was, John of Gaunt had had a mistress, Catherine Swynford, and had had children with her. Eventually, John of Gaunt's second wife would die, and he decided to marry Catherine Swynford, but had already had bastard children by her. Now, what he did was he asked the Pope to legitimize those children since he had married his wife. Since he had married their mother. And the Pope did so with the stipulation that them and their descendants could not inherit. However, this stipulation, we'll see, is sort of overlooked. Now, we're going to get to who is Margaret Beaufort, who is the mother of Henry Tudor. Now, John had a son named John, who had a son named John, who had a daughter named Margaret. At the age of 12 years old, she was married to Edmund Tudor. Who was Edmund Tudor? Well, we have to go back in time again. If you remember, Henry V had to marry a French princess. When Henry V died, the French princess, who was the Queen of France, Catherine of Valois, scandalously married Owen Tudor. And this was scandalous because he was considered nothing. He was like landed gentry, not suitable to marry a widowed Queen of England and a princess of France. Anyways, they decided to get married, and their children were Henry VI half-brothers, although not the royal half, so they couldn't inherit. So they had two children, Edmund Tudor and Jasper Tudor. And Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort, who was 13 years younger than him. She was 12 years old. They got married, and this was Henry VI's way of trying to make the Lancastrian branch of the family stronger. He would bring the Beaufort sort of claim to the throne with one of his brothers, and the Beauforts were rich, so he gave one of his brothers a lot of money, and she was the Beaufort heir. So at 13 years old, she has Henry Tudor. And it is such a terrible pregnancy for her because she's just 13 years old. Her body is not ready for her to have a child. that she never has children again. The damage is tremendous to her. But she has the one child that she loves more than life itself. But since Henry is a Lancastrian claimant to the crown, and the Yorks are in charge now, he has to spend most of his life in exile, and lives in exile until 1485. So now we get to one of the most mysterious events in human history. The princes in the tower. So the bastards, Edward and Richard, if you remember, Edward V had children that had been disinherited and had two sons, Edward and Richard. They were now being held in the Tower of London for their own safety. Now, there was a conspiracy and rebellion against Richard III brewing, which was going to be led by one of his closest allies, the Duke of Buckingham, who is another Beaufort claimant to the throne. Now, they had planned to depose Richard, and apparently he was going to, either with Elizabeth Woodville's help, put Edward V on the throne, or with Margaret Beaufort's help, put Henry Tudor on the throne. However, his rebellion failed, the Duke of Buckingham was killed, and Henry Tudor is forced to go back to France. However, during this whole rebellion, during all this confusion and this war, the princes in the tower disappear. Until this day, we don't know what happened to them. There are many theories of what happened to them. Possibly, Richard III decided to kill his nephews because he didn't want to deal with anyone trying to put them on the throne. Possibly, it was the Duke of Buckingham, who, by killing them and killing Richard, would make his claim much stronger, and if Henry Tudor mysteriously died, Buckingham would become king. Maybe it was Henry Tudor who decided to kill the princes or make them disappear, because if they were gone and Richard III was gone, he was king. And maybe it was Margaret Beaufort, because if they were gone and Richard was gone, her son Henry would become king. So, till this day, we have no idea what happened to those children. We don't know who did it, if they were ever actually killed, or if they were just kidnapped. But the stage is set right now for a battle between Henry Tudor and Richard III. Henry, in 1485, comes back to England with a much smaller army than Richard III, and prepares to fight against them. Now, the three most important people in this battle that's about to shape up, the Battle of Bosworth, who every English child and any person in England knows about because it is so famous, is about to shape up. The three important people are Henry Tudor, Richard III, and Thomas Stanley, known as Baron Stanley. Now, why is Thomas Stanley so important? Because he has an army of 6,000 men. He is Richard's Lord High Constable, so he's one of Richard III's greatest allies, and he also happens to be the third husband of Margaret Beaufort, meaning she had two before and they died. She didn't have three husbands at the same time. So this meant, at the same time as he was Richard III's one of his greatest allies, he also was Henry Tudor's stepfather. So the battle shapes up like this. On August 22nd, 1485, Henry Tudor arrives to the battlefield with about 5,000 men. Richard is estimated had 12,000 men, and Thomas Stanley and his brother, William, had about 6,000 men between them. So the battle lines, I took this from Peter Reed's Medieval Warfare. The battle lines shape up like this. This is Richard's main line of men. These are Northumberland's men, who had just arrived after marching for 8 days, so they were not in the front, they were tired. They didn't really want to get involved in the fighting because they didn't want to take sides, but they were officially on Richard's side. This is Richard and about 300 men on horses. This is Henry Tudor's battle lines. This is his main line. This is where Henry Tudor is with about 50 men. This is where Sir William Stanley is, and this is where Thomas Stanley is. So these two lines engage in fighting, and it's looking like Henry Tudor is going to lose the fight. So what Henry, who's over here, does is he decides to go ask his his stepfather, for help. So he arrives with about 50 men to here. Richard, seeing a way to end the battle quickly, even though he was winning, decides to take it, because Richard III was seeing treachery everywhere. He didn't know if he could trust the Stanleys to be on his side. He didn't know if he could trust any of his men to really be on his side. So he decided to take matters into his own hands, and against 50 and Henry's 50 men seem very easy to overcome with Richard's 300 men on horse. So Richard's men go up here, meet Henry's men, and they start fighting, and Henry's men are getting decimated. It is at this moment that William Stanley decides to attack Richard in the flank, which is on the side, and wipes out Richard's men. Richard falls off his horse, continues fighting on the ground, and this is where the famous quote, "My kingdom for a horse," that is in William Shakespeare's Richard III, is supposed to take place. Because Richard is saying, I'm going to give my entire kingdom for a horse to get away, and he's losing his kingdom because he can't get a horse to get away. He is killed by a common man while fighting, and the battle is over, and Thomas Stanley crowns Henry Tudor as the king, and he is named Henry VII. To bring peace to England, Henry VII marries Edward IV's daughter, Elizabeth, and the two of them have few children together, one of whom becomes Henry VIII, who becomes one of the most famous kings in English history and one of the most infamous. Anyways, Henry VII's marriage to Elizabeth creates the Tudor Rose, which you could see it's the Lancastrian red with the York white inside, showing the merging of the two and the peace that they brought to England. Now, with this peace that is brought to England, the English Renaissance is able to be ushered in. When there is fighting and civil war in the country, there's not time for a rebirth. There's no time for people to bring culture to their civilization. It's warfare and it's death. With peace being brought to England, there is now a time for men to sit down, and there is a time for them, men and women, to sit down and write and be artistic and create this rebirth in England. Shakespeare himself is able, about 100 years later, to have a period of peace where he's able to write for Elizabeth I and for James I. And he is able, not only did the War of the Roses usher in a period in time where he's able to write, but many of his historical plays are about the figures I have depicted. There is Henry IV, Part 1 and 2. There is Henry V. There's Henry VI. There's Richard III. Just to name a few of his plays that are based in the Wars of the Roses. So not only is the English Renaissance ushered in by the Wars of the Roses, but some of its greatest works are about the Wars of the Roses. Thank you.